Something has changed in your life, and somehow your soulmate just found out about it without hearing the full story from you. Maybe your name came up unexpectedly in a conversation. Maybe someone mentioned what you have been doing lately. Maybe they saw something that revealed you are entering a completely different chapter. Whatever the source was, the moment they heard the news, something inside them shifted. They may have tried to act completely normal, as if the information meant nothing, but privately, their mind started going somewhere they didn't expect. Because this wasn't simply news about you, it was a reminder that your life is moving forward. For a long time, your soulmate may have carried an assumption that somewhere in your future there would always be a space where they could return. They may have believed that no matter how much time passed, no matter how distant things became, the connection would remain frozen in the same place where they left it. But now they are hearing about a change that proves something they were not ready to accept. You are not standing still. You are making decisions, growing, changing your direction, and creating a future that doesn't depend on whether they finally decide to come back. And suddenly, they may be wondering something they never thought they would have to ask themselves. Do I still belong anywhere in their life? Imagine watching a familiar road suddenly change its direction. You recognize the road, but you can no longer predict where it will lead. That may be how your soulmate feels right now. They know the version of you they remember, but they don't know the version of you that is emerging. They may be wondering whether this new chapter will bring new people, new priorities, and new experiences that leave no room for the past. And the most unsettling part is that you may not have made this change to send them a message at all. You may simply be choosing yourself and moving towards something better, yet somehow your progress has forced them to look at their own hesitation. They are beginning to realize that while they were wondering whether they still wanted a place beside you, you were quietly building a life that may no longer have an empty seat waiting for them. And that realization is only the beginning, because what they heard about your life may have awakened a much deeper fear. What if you are finally moving into a future where they are no longer part of the story? The moment your soulmate realized that your life was changing, the questions probably didn't stop with the news itself. In fact, the information may have followed them long after the conversation ended. At first, they may have tried to treat it like something ordinary. They may have nodded, acted uninterested, or told themselves that it was simply good to hear that you were doing something new with your life. But privately, their mind may have started searching for answers they weren't prepared to confront. They may have wondered whether you still think about them when you make important decisions. They may have wondered whether this new chapter was something you had imagined with them once, or whether you had finally reached a point where their presence no longer entered your thoughts at all. And that is where their uncertainty begins to become emotional. Because hearing about a major change in your life doesn't simply tell someone what you are doing. Sometimes it reveals how much they no longer know about you. Your soulmate may suddenly realize that they are no longer close enough to automatically understand what is happening in your world. They may have once known your routines, your dreams, your fears, the things that excited you, and the things that kept you awake at night. But now, they may be learning about an important chapter of your life indirectly, through someone else, or from a distance. That realization can hurt more than they expected. Imagine standing outside a house you once knew perfectly. You remember where every room used to be, where the furniture stood, and where the familiar sounds came from. But now the windows look different, the walls have changed, and you can see lights turning on inside rooms you no longer recognize. You still know the house, but you no longer know what life looks like inside it. That may be how your soulmate feels about you right now. They recognize the person they once knew, but they are beginning to understand that your life has continued evolving without them. And this can create a strange mixture of curiosity and fear. They may start wondering what else has changed. Have your priorities changed? Have your feelings changed? Have you become more independent? Have you stopped looking backward? Have you met someone who makes you feel understood in ways they once did? These questions may not be spoken aloud, but they can become difficult to silence. And perhaps the question that sits underneath all of them is much more vulnerable. Do they still remember me when they imagine their future? Your soulmate may not necessarily need you to say that you still love them. What they may secretly want to know is whether they still occupy any emotional space in your mind. Because there is a difference between being remembered and being considered. Someone can remember a person from their past and still build an entirely different future. Your soulmate may now be wondering which one they are to you. Are they simply someone you once cared about, or are they still someone whose presence could influence your choices? That uncertainty can make them pay closer attention than they normally would. They may quietly look for clues in anything they can find. A photograph, a social media update, something a mutual friend says, a small change in your behavior. Even a sentence that seems completely ordinary may suddenly feel significant to them because they are trying to understand where they stand without directly asking. And the irony is that the more they search for certainty, the more uncertainty they may discover. Because you are not giving them a clear answer. You are simply living. You may be focused on your goals, your responsibilities, your happiness, and the new possibilities appearing in front of you. You may not even realize that your progress is creating questions in someone else's heart. But from their perspective, your silence can feel louder than words. They may have become accustomed to the idea that you would somehow remain emotionally connected to the past. Perhaps they believed that even if the two of you weren't together, some invisible thread would always keep you waiting. But now they are beginning to wonder whether that thread has become weaker. They may wonder whether you finally stopped checking for them, whether you stopped hoping for their return, whether you stopped imagining conversations that never happened. And that possibility can be deeply unsettling, because if they still have feelings, the idea that you may have emotionally moved beyond them changes the entire situation. They can no longer assume that their return would automatically matter. They may have to earn their way back into a life that has continued developing without them. And perhaps this is why they may become more curious about your new chapter than they want anyone to know. They may ask questions indirectly. They may want to know what caused the change, who is involved, how long you have been planning it, and what it means for your future. But underneath those questions may be one hidden question they don't have the courage to ask directly. Is there still room for me? They may not even fully understand why they care so much. They may tell themselves they are simply curious. But curiosity becomes different when the answer could change how you see yourself in relation to someone. If they discover that your new life is opening doors they were never part of, they may begin feeling a sense of loss before anything has actually been lost. And that is a powerful emotional state. They may imagine you surrounded by new people, entering new environments, experiencing opportunities they know nothing about, and becoming more confident with every step. They may imagine a future where your world becomes so different that they eventually become nothing more than a memory. Perhaps they're afraid of another person entering your life. But deeper than that, they may be afraid that you will no longer need what they once represented. Maybe they were once your emotional comfort, your familiar person, the one you wanted to tell things to. Now they may wonder whether someone else has quietly taken that position. And even if there is no one else, your independence can create the same fear. Because sometimes the greatest threat to an unfinished connection isn't another person. It is realizing that the person you left behind has learned how to be complete without you. Your soulmate may be beginning to understand that now. They may remember a version of you who wanted answers, who waited for clarity, who hoped they would eventually make a decision. But the person they are hearing about now may be different. You may have reached a point where your happiness is no longer dependent on whether they choose you, and that can force them to confront something they avoided for a long time. They may have assumed that because you cared deeply, you would always remain emotionally available. But caring about someone doesn't mean waiting indefinitely. Loving someone doesn't mean putting your life on hold. And your soulmate may now be realizing that you can still carry love for what happened while choosing to move towards something new. That realization can create regret because they may start wondering whether they misunderstood your patience. Maybe they thought your silence meant you would always be there. Maybe they interpreted your lack of anger as permission to keep delaying. Maybe they thought the connection would survive without effort. Now, as your life changes, they may finally recognize that your patience was never a promise. It was simply something you offered at the time. And once that becomes clear, they may begin looking at their own choices differently. They may ask themselves whether they waited too long to act, whether they should have spoken sooner, whether they should have taken the connection more seriously when they had the opportunity. And perhaps the hardest thought is this: what if you are entering a future that feels right without them? That possibility can make even someone who has been emotionally distant suddenly feel vulnerable. Because distance is easy when you believe the other person will remain exactly where you left them. But when that person begins moving forward, distance suddenly has consequences. Your soulmate may now be standing at that emotional crossroads. They can continue watching from afar, telling themselves that they will figure it out someday. Or they can acknowledge that your life is changing and decide whether they truly want to remain outside of it. And they may not have the answer yet, but the question is now inside them, and it is becoming harder to ignore. Because the more they hear about your new chapter, the more they may realize that they aren't simply curious about where you are going. They are wondering whether there is still a path that could lead them there with you. Now the situation begins to reach a much deeper point, because your soulmate may not actually know everything about this major change in your life. And that lack of information could be making their imagination much louder than reality. They may have heard only a few details, perhaps enough to understand that something significant is happening, but not enough to know what this new chapter truly means for you. And when someone still has unresolved feelings, uncertainty can become incredibly powerful. They may begin filling in the missing pieces themselves. They may wonder who will be around you now, what kind of people you are meeting, what opportunities are opening for you, and whether this new direction will eventually take you somewhere they can no longer reach. At first, they may tell themselves that they are simply curious. But the longer they think about it, the more personal those questions become. They aren't only wondering what your life will look like. They are wondering whether they still have any meaningful place inside it. Imagine standing at the edge of a city you once knew by heart, only to return years later and discover that new roads have been built. Old buildings have disappeared, and places that once felt familiar now look completely different. You still recognize the city, but you no longer know how to navigate it. Your soulmate may be experiencing something similar when they think about you now. They remember the person you were when the two of you were connected, but they are beginning to realize that the person you are becoming may not follow the same emotional map. And this realization can quietly awaken something they may have been trying to avoid for a long time. They may start comparing the person they remember with the person they imagine you becoming. Perhaps they remember you as someone who was deeply affected by their presence, someone who wanted clarity, someone who gave them emotional space even when they didn't know what to do with it. But now they may be hearing that you are making decisions, pursuing something new, changing your environment, or stepping into an opportunity that requires you to look ahead instead of behind. And that can create a very uncomfortable question for them. What if they have finally outgrown the version of themselves that was waiting for me? That thought can be more frightening than they expected, because if they always assumed you would remain emotionally connected to the past, they may have never considered what would happen when you started building a future without depending on it. Your growth becomes a mirror for their hesitation. They may suddenly see how much time has passed while they were still trying to understand what they wanted. They may remember moments when they had opportunities to become closer to you, but chose distance. They may remember conversations they avoided, feelings they didn't express, and decisions they postponed. And now, your major life change may be making those old choices feel much more significant. It's almost like watching a clock after realizing you never noticed how quickly the hands were moving. They may have thought there would always be more time, more opportunities, more chances to reconnect. But now they are realizing that your future is not waiting for their timing. And this is where their fear of losing you can become much more complicated. They may not only fear that you will meet someone else, they may fear that you will become so fulfilled in your new life that you will no longer feel the emotional need for them to return. That possibility can be incredibly difficult for someone who has been keeping a connection alive internally while remaining distant externally. They may have secretly believed that no matter how much time passed, some part of you would still be waiting for them to make a move. But now, they may be wondering whether your silence was actually the beginning of your release. Maybe you stopped checking for them. Maybe you stopped wondering what they were doing. Maybe you stopped imagining what would happen if they came back. Maybe you simply decided that your life had to continue, even without the answers you wanted. And if they sense that, even indirectly, it can create a feeling of urgency. They may begin wondering whether they missed their moment. They may ask themselves whether your new chapter is the result of finally accepting that they were not going to step forward. And that thought can trigger regret. Not because your growth is hurting them, but because your growth forces them to recognize the consequences of their own hesitation. There is something powerful about realizing that someone you once assumed would remain available has begun becoming unavailable. Not because they are angry, but because they are evolving. Your soulmate may understand that difference now. They may realize that you didn't necessarily stop caring. You simply stopped organizing your life around the possibility of them returning. And that can change everything. They may begin asking questions about your future that they never asked before. Where are you going? Who will you become? What will matter to you now? Will you still recognize the connection the same way? Will the memories still carry the same weight? Will there even be an opening for them if they eventually decide to come forward? These questions can become especially intense because they don't have direct access to your answers. They may have to rely on fragments, observations, mutual friends, or whatever information reaches them naturally. And every fragment can create another interpretation. If they hear that you are happier, they may wonder whether you have completely moved on. If they hear that you are focused on your goals, they may wonder whether relationships are even important to you anymore. If they hear that you are entering a new environment, they may wonder who you will meet there. If they hear that you are making a major personal decision, they may wonder whether that decision was influenced by the lessons you learned from your connection with them. They may even begin imagining a future where someone else becomes the person you share these new experiences with. And that is where jealousy can quietly appear, even if they have no right to claim you. They may not openly admit it, but the thought of someone else witnessing the version of you they never got to fully know could bother them deeply. Someone else may see your confidence. Someone else may hear your dreams. Someone else may support you through this new chapter. Someone else may receive the conversations, affection, and emotional closeness that your soulmate once had access to. And suddenly, what they once took for granted becomes something they fear losing permanently. But underneath that fear of another person is an even deeper fear. What if you no longer need them at all? Because sometimes people don't truly understand their emotional importance in someone's life until they sense that importance disappearing. Your soulmate may have once felt secure knowing that you cared. Even if they didn't act on it, knowing that you cared may have given them a quiet sense of emotional security. Now, hearing that your life is changing can disturb that security. They may realize that you can care about them and still choose a different path. You can remember them and still build something new. You can appreciate what happened and still decide that your future deserves something different. And perhaps that is the lesson they are being forced to understand. Love and access are not the same thing. Someone can remain important in your memories without remaining central to your future. and your soulmate may be slowly recognizing that distinction. This could also be why they may become more attentive to small details about you. They may notice changes they previously ignored. They may wonder why you seem different. They may analyze your words more carefully. They may look at your pictures and try to understand whether there is any sign that your heart has moved somewhere new. They may even revisit old memories because they are trying to compare the person you were with the person you are becoming. And every comparison may lead them back to the same uncomfortable realization: you are changing, and they don't know whether they are changing with you. That is the real fear. Not simply losing the old connection, but discovering that the future you are building requires a version of them they have not yet become. If they wanted to be part of your life before, perhaps they could rely on history. But history may no longer be enough. You may now require honesty, consistency, emotional maturity, and real action. Your soulmate may sense that without you ever saying it. They may understand that they cannot simply return one day and expect everything to feel exactly as it did. The new version of you may have different standards, different priorities, different boundaries, and perhaps that realization is what makes them hesitate even more. They may want to come closer but fear that the person they once knew would have welcomed them differently than the person you are today. So they remain in this strange emotional space where they are watching your life move forward while secretly wondering whether they still have a place in it. They may not know what that place would look like. They may not know whether it would be romantic, emotional, or simply a meaningful reconnection. But they know one thing: they don't want to become irrelevant. They don't want to look back one day and realize that they had a chance to be part of your future, but waited until the opportunity disappeared. And perhaps this is why your major life change has affected them so deeply. It wasn't just information about you. It was proof that time is moving. Your world is expanding. Your identity is evolving. Your future is becoming more defined, and while they were still holding on to questions about the past, you were quietly creating answers for your future. That contrast can force someone to finally examine their own heart. They may ask whether they are genuinely ready to let you go, or whether they have simply been assuming there would always be another chance. They may wonder whether they should continue watching from a distance, or finally take a step toward you. And even if they don't act immediately, the thought has already entered their mind. The possibility of losing their place in your life has become real. They can no longer assume that history alone gives them a permanent position. And as they continue thinking about your new chapter, they may eventually realize that the question is no longer what is happening in their life. The question is much more personal. If I still want to be part of it, what am I actually willing to do? The realization that your future is moving without them may now be becoming impossible for your soulmate to ignore. Until recently, they may have been comfortable keeping the connection somewhere in the background of their life, believing that no matter how much time passed, there would always be an opportunity to return. But hearing about this major change has disturbed that belief. For the first time, they may be looking at your life and realizing that you are not waiting for an answer from them. You are making decisions, stepping into new experiences, and becoming someone whose future is taking shape with or without their involvement. And that realization can create a kind of regret that is difficult to hide from yourself. They may begin thinking about all the moments when they had the opportunity to be closer to you, but chose uncertainty instead. They may remember conversations they avoided, feelings they kept hidden, and chances they assumed would come around again. At the time, those decisions may have felt harmless because they believed there was plenty of time. But now, your life change is showing them that time was never guaranteed. Imagine standing on a platform, watching a train slowly begin to move, while you are still deciding whether you want to get on. At first you think you have another minute, then the distance between you and the train grows. Suddenly, the decision becomes urgent because you can no longer pretend the train will remain there forever. Your soulmate may be experiencing something emotionally similar. Your future is beginning to move, and they are realizing that if they want to be part of it, hesitation may eventually become a decision in itself. They may still be unsure what they want to say or how they would approach you, but the thought of doing nothing is starting to feel different. Before, silence may have felt safe. Now silence may feel like a risk, because every step you take forward creates another possibility that you will eventually build a life where their absence no longer feels like something missing. And that can be a painful realization for someone who still carries feelings they haven't fully acknowledged. They may start asking themselves whether you are happier now, whether this new chapter has given you the peace they could not give you, whether you have finally stopped looking backward, and perhaps they may wonder whether your growth has changed the way you would receive them if they ever came back. This question can create fear because they cannot simply return to the old dynamic and expect you to be the same person. You have lived through everything that happened between you. You have learned from the silence, the uncertainty, the distance, and the unanswered questions. You may now understand yourself in ways you didn't before. You may know what you want from a connection. You may know what you will no longer accept. And your soulmate may sense that the person they once knew would have responded to them differently than the person you are becoming now. That can make them realize that the old version of the relationship is gone, even if the emotional connection hasn't completely disappeared. If there is ever another chapter, it would have to be built differently. They couldn't simply rely on history. They would need to show up differently. They would need to communicate differently. They would need to be clearer about what they want instead of expecting you to interpret their silence. And perhaps that is exactly what they are beginning to understand. Your major life change may have shown them that your future requires more than memories. It requires action. They may have once believed that because the two of you shared something meaningful, the connection would naturally survive whatever happened. But now they may be realizing that meaningful connections can still disappear when people refuse to nurture them. Love can exist and still remain unspoken. Feelings can be real and still fail to become a relationship. A person can matter deeply and still become distant if neither person takes the risk of moving toward them. And your soulmate may now be confronting that uncomfortable truth. They may be thinking about how easily they allowed time to pass. Maybe they assumed you would eventually reach out. Maybe they believed you would always be emotionally available. Maybe they thought their place in your heart was secure simply because of what you once shared. But now they are seeing that emotional importance does not automatically create permanent access to someone's life. You can remember someone and still move forward. You can care about someone and still choose yourself. You can appreciate the past without allowing it to determine your future. And if your soulmate truly wants to remain part of your world, they may eventually have to accept that. They may also be feeling a strange kind of jealousy, even if there is no specific person involved. It may not be jealousy of another relationship. It may be jealousy of your new life itself. They may feel uncomfortable imagining you experiencing new places, new opportunities, new conversations, and new happiness without them. They may imagine someone else standing beside you during moments they once believed would belong to the two of you. They may imagine you sharing your achievements with someone else, telling someone else your plans, and building memories with people who never knew the old version of your story. And those thoughts can make the past feel suddenly precious. What they once took for granted may now feel irreplaceable. But this is also where they may begin to understand that they cannot ask you to stop growing simply because they are not ready. Your life change may have nothing to do with them. You may not be trying to make them jealous. You may not be sending a hidden message. You may simply be choosing a direction that feels right for you. And that can make their emotional reaction even stronger because they cannot blame you for moving forward. They have to confront their own hesitation instead. They may realize that while they were waiting for certainty, you were creating momentum. While they were thinking about whether the connection could survive, you were deciding what kind of life you wanted. And perhaps they are beginning to understand that your growth was never a threat to them. Their fear comes from what your growth reveals about their own lack of action. That is a much harder truth to face. They may now wonder whether they should finally reach out before this new chapter becomes too established. But then another fear appears. What if you don't respond? What if you have already emotionally moved on? What if you are grateful for the past, but no longer interested in reopening it? What if they approach you expecting the person they remember and discover someone who has completely changed? Those questions can keep them frozen. They may want to know the answer, but they may also be afraid of receiving it. And this is why they might not immediately make a dramatic move. They may watch. They may think. They may ask subtle questions. They may wait for an opening. They may try to understand your emotional position before exposing their own. But internally, the pressure is growing because they now know that your life is not standing still. There is a difference between believing someone is available and knowing they are moving into a new chapter. The first creates comfort. The second creates urgency. Your soulmate may now be feeling that urgency for the first time. They may realize that if they continue postponing their feelings, one day there may be nothing left to postpone because you will have completely built a future that doesn't include them. And perhaps that is the realization that hurts the most. Not that you stopped caring, but that you learned how to keep living while caring. They may have assumed that if you still had feelings, you would somehow remain where they left you. But now they are discovering that love does not prevent growth. You can carry a memory and still walk forward. You can have unanswered feelings and still create new possibilities. You can leave the door emotionally unlocked without standing in front of it forever. And if your soulmate wants to enter your future, they may have to stop expecting the past to open that door for them. They will have to make a choice. They can continue watching your life from a distance and eventually become someone you once knew, or they can find the courage to discover whether there is still a place for them. That doesn't mean they are guaranteed to return, and it doesn't mean every feeling will become an action. But it does mean the emotional question has become real. They are no longer simply wondering what happened to you. They are wondering what will happen to them if they don't do anything. And that question can change a person. It can make them look at old memories differently. It can make them recognize the value of moments they once dismissed. It can make them understand the cost of silence. And perhaps your major life change is giving your soulmate the perspective they needed all along. Sometimes people don't realize how much they value a place until they see that someone else is preparing to close the door. Your new chapter may have shown them that the space they assumed would always be theirs is not guaranteed. If they want it, they must earn it through presence, honesty, and action. And if they are not willing to do that, your life will continue moving forward anyway. That is the turning point. Your future is no longer an idea waiting for them to make a decision. It is already happening. And your soulmate may finally be realizing that the question isn't whether you still have feelings for them. The question is whether they are brave enough to do something meaningful before your new life becomes a chapter they can only watch from the outside. And now, everything comes back to the one question your soulmate may be unable to escape anymore. Is there still a place for them in your life? Or have they waited so long that the space they once occupied has quietly disappeared? The major change they heard about may have seemed like ordinary news at first, but after everything they have been thinking about, it has become something much more personal. They may now understand that your life is entering a chapter they cannot control, predict, or pause. You are moving towards something new, and for the first time, they may be realizing that your future is not an empty page waiting for them to decide what happens next. You are already writing it, and perhaps that is what has affected them more than anything else. They may have spent a long time believing that the connection between you would somehow remain untouched by time. Even if there was distance, silence, or uncertainty, they may have carried an assumption that if they ever decided to return, you would still be emotionally standing in the same place. But now, they are beginning to understand that people do not remain frozen in the moments where others leave them. You have continued living. You have experienced things. You have learned things. You have changed your priorities. You may have discovered strengths you didn't know you had. And perhaps most importantly, you may have learned that your happiness cannot depend on someone else's ability to make a decision. That realization can be difficult for your soulmate because it means the old dynamic cannot simply continue. If they want to be part of your life now, they may have to meet you as you are today, rather than expecting to find the person you were when the connection first became important. And that can bring both hope and fear. Hope, because perhaps there is still an emotional connection between you. Fear, because they no longer know whether that connection is enough. They may wonder whether you would welcome them if they appeared again. They may wonder whether you would listen to what they have to say. They may wonder whether you would believe their intentions or question why they waited so long. And perhaps they are even afraid that you have become too strong to accept the uncertainty you once tolerated. That is a possibility they may not want to confront, but your new chapter is forcing them to consider it. They may have imagined that if they ever returned, they could simply pick up where everything stopped. But now they may realize that there is no going backward. Too much has happened. Too much has changed. The version of you they remember belongs to a different season of your life. If there is another chapter between you, it cannot simply be a continuation of the old one. It would have to be something new, built by two people who have grown through everything that happened before. And perhaps your soulmate is beginning to understand that this would require them to become more honest than they have been. They may have to admit what they feel. They may have to acknowledge what they regret. They may have to explain why they stayed silent. They may have to stop relying on hints, indirect questions, mutual friends, or distant observation, and eventually speak directly to you. That is where their real challenge begins. Feelings can be easy to hide when there is distance. Action is much harder to hide. Someone can secretly miss you for months without ever changing their behavior. Someone can think about you every night and still never send a message. Someone can regret what happened and still choose silence. But if your soulmate truly wants a place in your future, eventually their actions will have to reveal that desire. And perhaps that is why this new chapter has affected them so strongly. It has made the consequences of inaction visible. Before they could postpone. Now they can see what postponement might cost. They may realize that every new step you take creates another possibility that you will build a life where they no longer fit naturally. And that does not mean you are intentionally leaving them behind. You may not even be thinking about them when you make these decisions. You are simply living your life. But from their perspective, your independence may be showing them something they never fully understood. You were never going to wait forever. You may still care. You may still remember. You may even still have a part of your heart that wonders what could have happened. But you are no longer willing to sacrifice your future for an uncertain possibility. And that distinction may finally be reaching your soulmate. They may begin to understand that if they want to know whether there is still something between you, they cannot keep asking the universe for signs while doing nothing themselves. They cannot keep waiting for the perfect moment. They cannot expect you to read their mind. They cannot assume that because the connection once mattered, you will automatically make room for it again. If they want to know where they stand, eventually they will need the courage to find out. And perhaps they are already thinking about how they could approach you without exposing too much. Maybe they imagine sending a simple message. Maybe they think about asking how your new chapter is going. Maybe they consider using a mutual friend as an excuse to reconnect. Maybe they replay old conversations in their head, trying to figure out how they would explain themselves if you ever asked the question they fear most. Why now? And that question could be difficult for them to answer. Because perhaps the honest answer is that they didn't realize how much they could lose until they saw you moving forward. They didn't realize how deeply they wanted a place in your life until they saw that place might no longer be available. They didn't realize how much your presence mattered until they had to imagine your future without it. And sometimes that realization arrives late. It doesn't mean the past can automatically be repaired, but it can make someone finally understand the value of what they once had. Your soulmate may now be experiencing that understanding. They may be looking at your new chapter and recognizing that you are not the same person they once knew. You are becoming someone with a different sense of direction, and perhaps they are asking themselves whether they are capable of growing enough to meet you there. That is the real question, not whether they still feel something. They probably already know that they do. The real question is whether they are willing to transform that feeling into something real. Because if they return only because they are afraid of losing you, that may not be enough. If they return only because your new life made them jealous, that may not be enough. If they return only because they suddenly miss the comfort of the past, that may not be enough. What matters is whether they are prepared to bring clarity, consistency, honesty, and genuine intention into your present. You have already lived through the uncertainty. You don't need another version of it. And perhaps your soulmate is beginning to understand that too. They may realize that if they want a place in your future, they cannot simply ask for the old place back. They have to create a new place through their actions. They have to show that they understand the person you have become. They have to respect the life you are building rather than expecting you to rearrange it around them. And that is why your major change may have been so emotionally powerful for them. It gave them a glimpse of a future where you continue becoming happier, stronger, and more fulfilled without their involvement. That possibility may have frightened them, but it may also have awakened them. Sometimes people don't recognize the importance of a door until they realize it may eventually close. Your soulmate may now be standing in front of that door, wondering whether they should knock. They may not know whether you will answer. They may not know what is waiting on the other side. But they are finally realizing that if they never try, they will never know. And perhaps that is the hidden shift taking place within them. They are moving from assuming to questioning, from questioning to realizing, and from realizing to facing a choice. You don't have to make that choice for them. You don't have to send a signal telling them it is safe. You don't have to chase them into your future. Your responsibility is simply to continue living the life you are building. If they truly belong in that life, they will eventually have to demonstrate that through action. And if they don't, your future will still continue unfolding. That is your power in this situation. Your life does not become less meaningful because someone is uncertain about where they belong inside it. Your growth does not need permission. Your future does not need anyone's approval. And your heart does not owe permanent access to someone simply because the connection once mattered. Perhaps your soulmate is finally realizing all of this. They may have heard about one major change in your life, but what they actually discovered was something much bigger. You are no longer waiting for life to decide what happens to you. You are deciding for yourself. And now, if they want to be part of that story, they cannot remain a silent observer forever. They will have to decide whether they are ready to step forward, speak honestly, and meet you where you are now. Because the place they are wondering about may still exist, but it is no longer guaranteed. And perhaps that is exactly the realization they needed. They may have thought they had unlimited time to figure out what they wanted. Now they are beginning to understand that your future is already unfolding.